In discussing each of the Inklings, we have paid attention to how they considered their work and what they were doing. When we look at Lewis, we need to consider the role the imagination plays in relationship to the intellect and why it is that he writes the kind of stories that he does. When we look at Tolkien and his defense of fairy stories, he is discussing the nature of each of us as sub-creators. When we look at Chesterton, he is writing about the world as though it is full of wonder and welcome. And when we look at Sayers, she is really defined by this idea that each of us has a calling for a specific kind of response to the world that we live in. That our understanding of human nature lies in our relationship to a creator, and his image then is fulfilled in us when we are creating and making and fulfilling then that vocation. You can see the heavy influence of Chesterton on this idea. So when we have the unmasking of all of the anarchists in The Man Who Was Thursday, they each recognize their identity as one of the days of creation, so that the creator, Sunday, who symbolizes the Sabbath, the rest, the peace of God, the whole world, the universe itself, that they are then each called to represent part of creation in their lives, in the way that they act in the world. That's what human beings are made to do, is to embody aspects of the creator, to be creators. And Sayers has the same idea when she writes The Mind of the Maker. She walks through the parts of the Trinity and looks at how the aspects of the Trinity play out in the human being, that each of us then are creators. We are homo faber. And what she means by that, she doesn't mean worker, that we are made to work in the sense of a Marxist would, that each of us are ants in an anthill, that we each have that kind of role in the world. It is a much higher level of an idea of work and making, that the whole creator of the universe showed us each how to be creators, and we each have our own specific gifts that are not confined by our gender, that are not confined by our age, but are actually given to us to fulfill. And so, for example, in Gaudy Night, you have Harriet Vane saying to Mrs. Bendick. Mrs. Bendick is a woman who received a high degree at Oxford and yet decided to become a farmer. And Harriet Vane finds this very perplexing. She says, a plowshare is a nobler object than a razor. But if your natural talent is for barbering, wouldn't it be better to be a barber, and a good barber, and use the profits, if you like, to speed the plow? However grand the job may be, is it your job? What she's pointing to here, and I think she says it differently in the BBC version, she says something like, it might be a noble thing to scrub floors, but I'm rather bad at scrubbing floors, and I'm rather good at writing mystery novels, so I write mystery novels. This is the same kind of idea here, is that you had not necessarily confined one to a specific role based on your misconceptions about who they are. And of course, the major misconception for Sayers is that being a woman, she would be confined to be staying at home and working at home. And these were ideas that were very popular, 1930s and 1940s Britain, especially as men returned from war, not to be taking their jobs from them, but giving them the jobs they needed to remember who they were, to get an understanding of themselves as homo faber, and not to take the roles of men, to replace the men in society. And this becomes a central controversy in the novel, not to replace men. Sayers, of course, was asked to speak a great deal about this. She gives a talk called Are Women Human? And writes quite a few statements along these lines, having to argue for things she never, of course, wanted to argue for. She remembers getting a query from a magazine asking if she would write about detective fiction from a woman's perspective. She makes some witty comment along the lines of, what do you mean from a woman's perspective? I mean, I could no more have a woman's perspective on a car or on cheese. I mean, you can't get a woman's perspective on detective fiction, whatever that would look like. I can give you a detective fiction novelist's perspective on detective fiction, if you would like that. So this misunderstanding of gender really plays out in Gaudy Night, and it shows to be a lot of the insecurities that Harriet Vane is facing have to do with her gender and with the assumptions that are placed on gender during the 1930s. the big question is whether or not she should marry Lord Peter Wimsey, who has been proposing to her since Strong Poison and who she has been turning down. As one character says, a great woman must either die unwed or find a greater man to marry her. And that limited the great woman's choices considerably, since through the world, of course, abounded in great men, it contained very much larger population of middling and commonplace men. And the great man, on the other hand, could marry where he liked. So here becomes the great inequality between the two of them, is that a great woman is not going to be a great man is not necessarily going to desire a great woman. He can choose any of the ones beneath him. But a great woman can only choose a great man. She can't choose a middling or a common man because they're not going to want her. So this is an inequality that a successful or great woman begins to have more or less and less options to her. And this is something that I think that is probably still experienced and still common today. You have, I just have to do personal anecdote even though it's being recorded. I remember I received a PhD at 26. And so, of course, on the dating scene, my very Southern mother would constantly caution me against ever mentioning that I have a PhD on a date, lest the man be turned off and turned away. So don't tell anyone that you're a professor or a doctor if you want any chance to get married. And I think that Sayers had this same problem, is that she sees that in her character for Harriet. She doesn't want Harriet to settle for any less, and she is worried about what marriage would look like for this character, the more that she started to really be fascinated by Harriet, even more so than Lord Peter. Now, the story itself, as I've mentioned, is about a poltergeist, and so we have to collect the evidence and figure out who the poltergeist is. I definitely solved the case, and I'm a little begrudging that Peter Wimsey has to come in and help Harriet Vane solve it, because I don't think you need the man to come in and solve the case. The woman could have done it just fine. But the nasty letters that are collected, the fact that we have the position of women in the modern state, a strongly pro-feminist book that is completely destroyed, and the vandalism of the new library. As one of the characters, we'll get what she says later, what's the point of a new library for women? All those books are going to go to their head and ruin their minds. And so we have this collection of evidence that seems to point to a man, but as the warden and dean also note, if it points to a man, how is he getting around the grounds? So whoever it is seems to be anti-woman, and the only thing they can imagine being anti-woman is a man. Which, spoiler alert, it's not a man. The question for Harriet centers around whether or not she must choose between being a heart or being a brain. On the one side, we imagine, or at least in the 1930s, they would imagine that women are only disposed towards emotional interests, that they are emotional creatures and not intellectual ones. And yet at the same time, men are expected to also be as emotional as they are intellectual. They're allowed to have both, whereas women are only supposed to have one or the other. And Harriet's question, I think, is Dorothy Sayers' question, but suppose women have both hearts and brains. What then does it look like to be both a mystery writer and a wife? We do note a little similarity. Sayers read quite a few Austen novels, of course, and in the same way that we have Jane Austen in Persuasion, demonstrating that her female protagonist must be worth loving because she has so many suitors, so too we have Harriet Vane being sought out after by, you could consider Peter Wimsey's nephew to be a suitor, but not quite. Of course, he knows that his uncle is really the suitor. But there's a lot of flirtation there. He seems to find her quite attractive and interesting. And also, of course, poor Mr. Pomfret, who proposes. And Harriet, at this point, does not think she will marry anyone. Whether or not this is quite true, we will see over the course of the story. Something to remember that kind of lies in the background, there's Sayers on the left, is this idea of World War I and World War II. Now, we don't get to see much of Peter Wimsey's discussion of the war. We'll look at a couple of examples, but for the most part, he doesn't mention his service in the war. And they do talk a bit about the rising problems in Europe and how they could be leading to a second war. And they both cringe at the thought that this could be the case. Nobody wants to have war a second time again. But the war does linger over the narrative, and the connections between people what they have all survived together. Sayers' husband, Mac Fleming, actually suffered from PTSD. It's what kept him from working. It's also what caused many problems in their relationship. And so when Sayers writes about this, she's being very vulnerable, admitting some of the things that she was experiencing herself from the war. This course is not going into much detail about the effects on the war on these writers, but Joe LeConte has a great book about the effects of World War I on Lewis and Tolkien. It would be nice if someone also did more research and looked at the ways that it affected Sayers and other Inklings during this time. So let's look at the conversation between Peter and Harriet that really refers to the conversation Sayers was having with herself in creating this novel. You would have to abandon the jigsaw kind of story and write a book about human beings for a change. I'm afraid to try that, Peter. It might go too near the bone. It would hurt like hell. Well, what would it matter if it made a good book? And Vane says at this point that he was, she says something like, he's about as gentle or protective as a chainsaw or something along those lines, that she expected him to be more nurturing of her, and especially because he had saved her from the gallows, that surely he was going to be the knight in shining armor. And yet what she's finding from Peter over the course of this novel is he's not playing that role. He's not following the expectations of kind of the fairy tale story from Strong Poison, in which the detective comes in and saves the damsel in distress, and that's the role she's expected to play from here on out. And that's the role he's expected to play. Instead, he becomes much more interesting by they're not dating, by assuming she's going to go back to Oxford and solve the problem for Shrewsbury College, by guiding her through that, supporting her in that effort, not cautioning her against the danger, not keeping her from the danger. And even when it comes to the emotional danger of putting herself into her own fiction, he doesn't protect her from that either. He assumes that she can take it. And I think these kinds of knowledge of her character and of seeing her as a strong woman makes Peter a more admirable character and actually gives Harriet Vane a lot of respect for him. So it's these thickening of the characters that is what drew a lot of people to reading Gaudy Night differently than they had read Sayers' previous work. Lewis himself did not appreciate Gaudy Night. Tolkien did, except for all of the humdrum, about women's rights and things like that. But for the most part, it was not received among the Inklings as highly as it was received more broadly.